you wrote this book about the Cold War. You worked and lived through it. Are we closer to nuclear war today than back then?
That's a difficult question to answer because in many ways we're comparing, apples to oranges. I'd say we're in a very dangerous situation today. Um, and one of the things that might push the modern era, ahead of the 1980s in terms of a risk of nuclear war is that unlike the 1980s, where we trained for nuclear war and we were prepared to fight a nuclear war, which is why there was a real risk of it because it wasn't taboo. We were going to do it.
Mm.
Today, we operate under the notion that it's just not going to happen. No, people talk about it, but we're just not going to. It's not real. It's this fake thing that allows people like Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken to get up there and talk strong and big and thump their chest because to them it's just a game. It's a rhetorical exercise. When in fact, if you listen to Russian President Vladimir Putin, nuclear weapons are real, and that Russia has red lines, and if those red lines are crossed, there's a real potential that Russia will use nuclear weapons. And if Russia uses nuclear weapons, it won't be a limited nuclear war; it'll be total nuclear war, and we're all going to die. The Russians have deployed nuclear weapons to Belarus because Belarus now has become an important Russian ally. They have sort of this economic political union. Their militaries are working almost seamlessly. And you have Poland and the Baltic states all implementing policies designed to overthrow Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, and replace him with a democratic leader. Indeed, one of these opposition figures, actually she was the wife of an opposition figure that she ran on the ballot in the contested election, I think in 2020. And she now resides in one of the Baltic countries where they have recognized her as the legitimate head of Belarus.
Oh, come on.
And so, from the Russian-Belarus perspective, you have Poland and the Baltic states actively conspiring to overthrow the Belarusian government. And so and with that, the potential of NATO attacking Belarus, because, of course, Poland and the Baltic states are NATO nations. And so Russia is basically replicating the nuclear umbrella that the United States already provides to NATO. People are sitting there condemning the Russian move. And believe me, I'm not happy about it. It's escalation. I understand why they're doing it, but I wish they didn't do it. But, Russia is basically giving Belarus access to air-delivered nuclear weapons and surface-to-surface missile-delivered nuclear weapons that will be retained under the control of Russia up until the point where they turn them over to the Belarusians. And then they would be launched based upon targets and joint procedures developed by Russia and Belarus. This is a replication, so to speak, of the capability that NATO enjoys with these B-61 bombs that have been they're stored, I believe, in 5 different locations throughout Europe. They support there's NATO nations like Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and others have aircraft that are considered to be nuclear capable, and the pilots have been trained to deliver these B-61 bombs. And so, but NATO says, well, these weapons would have to be released by the United States before we could use it, all that stuff. It's not an independent nuclear thing. Well, the same thing holds true with the Belarusians.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have any nuclear weapons. They have access to nuclear weapons that can be loaded on Belarusian nuclear-capable assets, then be used in defense. But, in some ways, I consider this to be a good thing, not just, because someday this war in Ukraine is going to end. And if we live, there will have to be concerted negotiations about nuclear disarmament. Mm. And Russia has now just created chips. They have chips that can be traded, whereas before they didn't. And so there was never any dialogue about this. Russia has created chips that can be bargained away. And in many ways, it replicates something I write about in my book. That is the decision of the United States. They wanted the SS-20 missile to be removed, but the Soviets were like, why are we going to get rid of a missile that means everything to our national security? And what are you getting rid of? Nothing. And so the United States actually had to escalate the tension by deploying the Pershing II missile, the ground-launched cruise missile, putting chips on the table that now could be negotiated away, and we went to zero. So I think that's what's behind the Russian action, because it doesn't change the nuclear equation one bit. In fact, it probably makes the any nuclear response that much more inefficient, because now you've put in extra procedures, moves, command and control, etc. It'd be much more efficient just to let Russia launch the nukes, because chain of command control is all seamless. But what Russia's done is put chips on the table, and I think that once this war ends, there hopefully will be a new arms control negotiation process. And one of the things that Russia will now be able to do is create the conditions for American withdrawal of the B-61 bombs from NATO by being willing to trade the Russian nukes that are in Belarus. This is something that's happened in the past. Everybody talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis,
right?
And they operate under the assumption that America made the Soviets back down, and that's literally not what happened. The Soviets put chips on the table, creating a game where they were able to get
the American
Jupiter missiles that were in Turkey and in Italy withdrawn. The Jupiter missiles in Turkey were literally right on Russia's next door. I mean, we're all like, how dare the Russians put, missiles in Cuba? Well, how dare America put Jupiter missiles in Turkey aimed at the Russians? So they created the conditions for a horse trade, and then we did the same thing with the INF Treaty, and I think that's what Russia's doing with this. So it's dangerous, but it's also, I think, forward thinking in terms of disarmament potential. My concern today, though, is that we are one mistake, one misunderstanding away from somebody using a nuclear weapon, and then we're all going to die, because there's no such thing as a limited nuclear war, not from the Russian perspective. And should the United States use nuclear weapons, should NATO use nuclear weapons against Russia, Vladimir Putin has already answered the question of what would he do. He said that, we'll launch and you'll all die and we'll all die, but we'll go to heaven as martyrs, meaning at least we have God on our side. The Russian academic Karaganov, who wrote this article that we alluded to about, a new preemptive arsenal, he's gambling on the fact that no American president will be willing to trade Boston for Poznan being a Polish city.
So that gamble.
If Russia, confronted by, a persistent NATO effort to destabilize it, opted not to wait for potential NATO success, but to preempt it by using a nuclear weapon against Poznan, that an American president would ultimately not retaliate, because they're not willing to give up one or two or three or more American cities as a result. That's a gamble. I certainly hope that we never test that theory, but it's there, which makes the situation today very, very, very dangerous.